I've returned, dear friend, refreshed and ready to finish the story of Juli, Fife, Eathu, and Estoh. Last we spoke, the friends had snuck into the inner city, a place forbidden to them by the laws of the Sek, and, unfortunately for the group, were found by Brutum, a low mage of some skill. And as they fled, hounded by this Julucadi, their only escape from the fires of his blood magic was a dark opening in a storm drain, into which they leapt. Let us find them there now. Juli felt himself fall, arms and legs flailing in darkness, reaching for something, anything to grab onto. Would he fall forever? Where had Eathu gone, Fife and Estoh? He crashed and skidded against hard stone, spinning as he went. A sloped surface, he could surmise that much, and within seconds he stopped rolling and slid downward. Beneath him, the same smooth, slimy rock of the tunnel wall burnt and tore at his skin, but he did not slow. He turned to look where he was going, but saw only a large black circle, like the maw of some beast held greedily open. Then he was falling again, tumbling. Then he crashed into wetness. The smell, that horrid, rotten, filthy smell, filled his nose, his mouth, and a rushing filled his ears, which quickly dulled to a low roar. The air left his stomach. He was underwater, flailing against the weight of it, pulling himself upward. His hands groped ahead and hit rock. No, not up. He was going down. Lungs burning, he spun, using the last of his strength to propel himself off the stone. He pulled desperately against the water, thrashing, fighting to find the surface. Suddenly, he emerged, gasping for breath in a shower of liquid. His arms slammed against a hard surface. He pulled himself atop it, then puked a mixture of water and bile. The taste was horrific, but around it he filled his lungs with air. Juli lay in the dark, aware somewhere in the back of his mind that he had lost his shoes and his hat. Then a new noise came to him, splashing sounds. But he was out of the water. Why hadn't they stopped? Eathu screamed out. Juli was back on his feet.
"Eathu, where are you?"
"Here, Juli,"
shouted Eathu. Juli jumped back into the water, careful to keep one hand on the rocky ledge, and swam toward the noise. He swept the darkness with his free arm until he hit something fleshy. Eathu. Grabbing the half-breed by his baggy clothing, Juli hauled him atop the stone, then pulled himself out again. He listened for more splashing, but there was only the gasps and retching of Eathu.
"Where are we?"
said Eathu after he caught his breath.
"By the stars, I don't know,"
said Juli as he lay on the cold stone.
"Where is Estoh and Fife?"
said Eathu.
"Should we shout for them?"
said Juli.
"I don't know," said Eathu. "I was scared, Juli. That mage was going to hurt us. Do you think he'll follow us down here?"
Juli blinked, remembering heat that felt it would burn the skin from his flesh. He tried to make out his surroundings in the dark, but it was impossible.
"I don't think so, but I'm not sure." "Where should we go?"
said Eathu. Juli got to his feet, wishing Estoh and Fife were with them. Estoh would know what to do, though, he supposed, Estoh had gotten them into this mess. The cold, wet stone beneath him felt rough. At least that was something. It wasn't the same slimy, smooth stuff that made up the tunnel. He groped in the darkness until he found a wall.
"Hold on to me, Eathu,"
said Juli. He felt they were in some kind of tunnel, though he couldn't say why. He supposed it could be a big, domed room just as easy. The air was damp and warm, but he felt no breeze. His mouth tasted foul, and his stomach felt sour despite the hunger. He crept, feeling each new step with a bare foot. Wherever they were, it was clear to him the path bent to the left. Every 10 steps brought nothing but air beneath his searching toes. A few minutes later, they heard Estoh.
"Juli! Eathu! Fife!"
he yelled.
"Estoh!"
yelled Juli.
"Juli?"
came the response.
"Yes, we're here,"
shouted Juli. a weight lifted from him of which he had been only vaguely aware. Estoh made his way to them, swimming from one side of what Juli was now sure was a series of tunnels to the other. The Nehemish boy appeared as a tall shadow in the dark.
"Have you seen Fife?"
he asked.
"No. I watched him jump in after you back in the tunnel, but I've only seen Eathu here,"
said Juli.
"Fife!"
yelled Estoh. His voice echoed through the darkness, followed by silence.
"I hope he is okay,"
said Eathu.
"Do you think that mage will be after us, Estoh?"
said Juli. After a long pause, the Nehemish boy replied, "No, I don't think so. He can't care much about the four of us, and he'd not jump down here. Plus, we'd have seen the light of his fires, I think." It made sense to Juli, who nodded despite the dark.
"Fife!"
yelled Estoh again, but there was nothing.
"What should we do, Estoh?"
said Eathu. Estoh sighed.
"Try to find our way out of here. We'll pick a way and go, and hopefully find Fife on the way."
Juli's stomach grumbled. Whatever sickness the water caused had lost out to his hunger. Behind him, Eathu sniffed and blew his nose. Was the boy crying? If one of them would, it would be Eathu.
"Follow close now,"
said Estoh as he shuffled off.
"I'd say we should swim, but I don't want to miss any doors or ladders on the wall." "I don't mind staying out of the water,"
said Eathu. Juli grunted in agreement. They went on that way for what felt a lifetime to Juli. Estoh shouting for Fife, but no answer ever coming. He wondered if the tall boy had swum off or caught himself before he fell down to wherever they were. They'd find him back home, he guessed, after they had escaped. Maybe he was already back there. Yet darkly he wondered if the mage had gotten him, or... No, he had to be back home. He had to be. Estoh quit shouting when his voice weakened, and they traveled in silence. Now and then, Juli thought he heard faint splashing, like a fish jumping on the river, but when they stopped to listen, there was nothing. Eventually, Estoh sank to the stone floor.
"What is it?"
said Eathu. "We need to rest," said Estoh. "Maybe sleep. I've no clue what time it is."
"No, not here. We can't sleep here,"
said Eathu. "Hush, Eathu," said Juli. He knew it was late from the pain in his stomach. There had been times he had gone without food for most of the day, and this felt worse.
"Fife!"
shouted Estoh weakly. There was no reply.
"I'm sorry,"
said Estoh.
"I just wanted to see it, the inner city, what it must be like to be a mage. All that power, that wealth. I thought maybe if I saw it, I don't know."
"It's okay, Estoh," said Juli.
"You didn't know that would happen, and it was the most beautiful place I've ever seen."
Eathu did start to cry then, loud sobs that shuddered through the tunnels. A hot anger grew in Juli. It was always the same with Eathu, the first to cry, to complain, to run away. "Stop your crying, Eathu," said Juli.
"We all knew it was dangerous, and you had your chance in the square, and again at the drain. You should have stayed behind." "I'm sorry, Juli,"
said Eathu between snotty gasps.
"I just want my ma and da."
"What good is crying going to do?" said Juli.
"We should try to sleep a bit," said Estoh. "When we wake up, we'll all feel better. I truly am sorry, Eathu."
Juli rubbed his eyes. Since they'd stopped, he'd realized how sore his feet were, how tired his legs had become. Between their escape, the fall, the swimming, and the long, slow, deliberate steps during their walk through the dark, he'd become exhausted. Competing with this was a dull, hungry ache in his stomach. In the end, the exhaustion won out, and leaning against the wall, he slipped into sleep. He dreamed he was in the swamp, crouched near the Woet, digging through vines and grass and leaves and rotting wood, looking for the dirt beneath. Behind him stood someone who he could not see but knew was there in the way you know things in dreams. It was a hot, bright day. He dug frantically through the green things, but each wad of foliage he ripped up only revealed more leaves, more grass, more vines, more soft, damp wood. More insects. Swarms of them lived in the jade shadows of such places. Part of him feared to place his hands there, never knowing if his fingers might brush against a pearl green bowl spider or a nest of bright pink box ants. He dug on, fingers ablaze of pain, searching, always searching for the dirt, dimly aware that if he found it, he'd dig still. As long as that figure stood behind him, he'd dig. A screaming entered the dream, a terrible screech of urgency. Somewhere in his mind he knew he should awake, but it was a far thought, buried under the heaviness of fatigue. Then something was shaking him, and slowly his eyes crept open. His consciousness rushed out of the dream. He was in the dark again, body aching, foul taste in his mouth, hunger grinding at his stomach. Estoh was howling, and Eathu was shouting into his ear.
Wake up, Juli!
Shouted Eathu.
Get it off me!
Shouted Estoh. Over the cries, he could hear something thrashing in the water.
What's going on?
He said as he leapt to his feet, feeling the wall behind him, trying to make out anything in the darkness.
It's got my leg!
Yelled Estoh, an urgent terror in his voice. Juli's skin crawled with ice. He dropped to his knees and crawled forward, arms stretched, groping for anything. It wasn't long before they found damp clothing. Estoh. A second later, and the Nehemish boy grasped his hand.
Something has his leg!
Shouted Eathu. Estoh screamed and shoved Juli's hand down his body. It brushed against something as soft and slimy as a skinned fish. Juli pushed against the thing and it shuddered and jiggled, recoiling in a thrash that drenched him in warm, foul water.
Make it stop!
Yelled Estoh. Juli began hammering at the thing, fists balled, like a babe throwing a tantrum, beating at whatever it was.
Help him, Juli!
Cried Eathu, but the slimy mass did not budge. What was worse, it made no sound. There was only Estoh's screaming, Eathu's pleading, and the hollow, moist thump of his fists hitting it. Frustrated, he jumped to his feet and kicked downward as hard as he could. His bare foot sank into soft, spongy flesh. He lifted it again and stomped down, again and again as Estoh cried out. He heard a heavy splash and drove his foot down again. This time it found a warm, wet firmness.
Stop! Stop!
Yelled Estoh. Juli stopped.
Are you okay?
Sobbed Eathu.
My leg, said Estoh. What did it do to my leg?
Juli blinked in the blackness. It was dark, so unbelievably dark. There was a splash somewhere behind him.
We gotta get out of here,
he said.
Can you stand, Estoh?
Said Eathu.
I think I can, said Estoh.
Help me, Eathu, said Juli, bending to lift Estoh by the arm.
What was that thing?
Said Eathu as he made his way to Estoh's other side.
I don't know, said Estoh. I woke up and it was on my leg. This sharp pain. It still burns, Juli.
Juli draped Estoh's arm over his shoulder, then took a step.
Can you put weight on it?
Said Juli.
A little, I think, said Estoh. But it hurts. By the stars, I wish Fife were here, said Eathu. He's much stronger and taller than I. Just keep him up, said Juli. I've got this side.
Juli wondered if the shorter boy could support Estoh at all. He let him take the side farthest from the water.
Do you think it will come back?
Said Eathu.
I don't know,
said Estoh between gasps of pain.
I hope not.
Are you bleeding, Estoh? Said Juli. They stopped while Estoh felt the wound.
It's bleeding a little, but not bad, said Estoh. At least I think. It's hard to tell what's blood and what isn't. It feels sticky, warm, puffy. What did it do?
But silence was the only answer as they began their journey again.
Fife, said Juli. What if whatever it was got Fife?
No, said Estoh.
We'd have heard it, him screaming or something.
The Nehemish boy's voice was shaking. Juli wondered if it was the pain. They marched on. For how long, Juli couldn't tell, but the longer they walked, the heavier Estoh grew, and the deeper his breathing became. How long could they keep it up, he wondered, marching in endless darkness, jumping at each drip of water that echoed through the endless tunnels. Perhaps it would be better if he left the others, went alone to escape than sent help. Even if his Da was in a mood, he'd come. Estoh's parents would too, even his brothers. And Eathu's Da would lead the charge. He could go on ahead, leave Eathu to watch Estoh and get out. As he was about to bring this up with the others, Eathu screamed, and Estoh toppled towards the wall.
Eathu,
said Juli over Estoh's groans of pain.
There's something here,
said Eathu.
I fell into something.
Really? Said Juli.
I think it's a stairway, and it's going up.
Yes, oh yes, said Juli. His stomach growled loudly in the dark. You need to eat, Juli, said Estoh in a weak, raspy voice.
I'm sorry.
What's that? Said Juli.
Sorry,
said Estoh.
Shouldn't have brought us down here. Where is Fife?
Juli was quiet as he lifted the boy's arm again to climb the stairs. The tunnel they now followed twisted in on itself, climbing upwards. As it did, higher and higher, the air cleared and the smell of the place lifted, making Juli aware how much his own soggy shirt and pants stunk. They inched onward, breathing heavily as they ascended through the blackness. Juli's toes became bloody as he searched with bare feet for each new step. And just as he wondered if the stairwell was as endless as the tunnels below, he passed around a corner and a faint orange light illuminated the steps before him.
Thank the stars,
said Eathu. Estoh only groaned, and though the light gave Juli a moment of relief, he felt terror at the prospect of seeing Estoh's wounds. That a Hamish boy had been uttering nonsense between heavy breaths, apologizing and asking for Fife, again and again. He gripped Estoh's arm and drug him upward. Around a final bend, they found an archway leading to a wide, low-ceilinged tunnel lit by a distant torch. Doorways ran along the walls to either side, some with large, thick wooden doors, others empty black portals of darkness surrounded by rotting wood and rusting metal. He pulled Estoh into the room, then closed his eyes and stood still.
Oh, Estoh,
gasped Eathu.
Your leg, Juli, what should we do?
Juli held his breath, then, slowly, turned to look for himself. It was both worse and better than he expected. In his mind, Estoh's leg was split like a gutted fish, a gory mess of blood and bone, chewed through like a grin lizard had gotten to him. Instead, what he saw in the dim torchlight was a circle of puffy, black flesh, like a part of Estoh's leg had begun to rot. Near the edges of the circle were red tendrils, like creeper vines snaking from the wound. It looked like a black, blazing sun. Estoh's copper-colored skin appeared pale, even in the weak orange light. His head sunk, and his eyes fluttered.
We gotta find help,
said Eathu. Juli licked his lips. Okay, let's keep going. They marched toward the torch, passing sturdy doors and black rooms he hoped were empty.
Is anybody out there?
Shouted Eathu.
Eathu,
said Juli in a shaky voice.
We don't know.
Moaning sounded from behind a door to his right, followed by soft thumping, as if something beat weakly against it.
Who's there?
Said Juli. The only reply was a loud thump followed by a long, pitiful groan. Wide-eyed, he stared at the door. Would it open? But it was a momentary fear. At the center of the door was a metal square, a lock, a rather large and complex one compared to those he'd seen around his father's forges. Those were meant for chests. This was giant. Juli lifted Estoh's arm and started toward the torchlight. A muffled scream sounded from another door. His blood chilled. The scream was followed by babbling, more thumping, and what sounded like crying, though he wasn't sure if it was a man, woman, or something else.
What is this place?
Said Eathu.
I dunno,
said Juli. His gut dropped as they approached the torch. It was a permanent fixture in the wall, fire fueled by some liquid he didn't recognize, nothing he could take with him. The tunnel continued down hallways to his left and right, and at intervals were more flickering fires. He turned left. Behind him, the screaming continued. This new hallway was much like the last, a long procession of doors and empty rooms. Estoh hung heavily now, barely lifting his feet, and Eathu was panting, exhausted. Juli's own legs were burning after the long march up the stairs. He stopped. "We need to take a break," he said as he hobbled to the cold stone wall under one of the lights. He lowered Estoh to the ground before taking a seat himself. Eathu collapsed next to Estoh, breathing heavily. So near the light, the darkness around them seemed to grow deeper at its edge, until he felt as if he was on some bright island in an abyss.
"Estoh's breathing sounds funny,"
said Eathu. Juli looked down to find the half-breed had laid his head across the Nehemish boy's chest.
"It sounds ragged, like it's hard for him,"
said Eathu. Juli frowned. What should they do? This felt better than the darkness of the tunnels below, but it seemed no closer to their escape. "Help me," came a rasping whisper. Juli looked to Estoh. Had he spoken? But he only saw Eathu's dirty, frightened face. The half-breed shook his head. The voice hadn't been Estoh's. "Help me," came the whisper again.
"Who are you?"
said Juli as he rose to his feet. Into the light of the torch appeared a long, pale arm whose fingers were tipped with sharp, dangerous claws. It gripped the stone floor, then flexed as it dragged a misshapen, lumpy mass of naked flesh into the light. At the center of the mass lay a mouth surrounded by puffy, wide lips filled with jagged brown teeth. "Help me," it hissed as it clawed its way closer, now revealing a lower body covered in fur, skin, and scales. It had no eyes that Juli could see. Eathu screamed and bolted down the hallway. The sound was answered by laughter, gibbering, nonsense cries, thumping at doors, the rattle of chains.
"Eathu, come back here!"
Juli yelled as he grabbed Estoh under the arms. The Nehemish boy was heavy. He groaned as he tugged him away from the thing. He screamed at Eathu again, but there was no reply. Damn the half-breed. In the last he'd abandoned him, after all the times he'd stuck up for the boy. After the beatings, the black eyes and loose teeth, after the scrapes he'd taken, all the times his mother had screamed at him for befriending the boy, all the days others had looked down on him calling Eathu his friend. In the end, what had it gotten him? He backed into something hard. Juli turned to find a tall man in a dark robe and a high square hat, barely visible in the torchlight. In one hand he held a long spear, in the other he held Eathu by the shoulder. The man frowned. "What are you doing, boy?" said the man in a deep voice. "You don't look like one of these wretches." He swung his spear to take in his surroundings.
"My friend,"
managed Juli. Yes, said the man as he strode forward. "You've excited them, that's all." As the man drew closer to the light, the thing on the ground cried loudly, lips quivering within the lump of flesh, and began to turn, using its clawed arm to pull itself away. "Stand up now," said the man.
"He can't stand,"
said Juli, still clinging to Estoh.
"Something in the water bit him, and now he won't wake up."
The man's frown deepened. Then he bent and probed Estoh's leg with a long finger. "A bite, and a terrible one at that," said the man. "Come, I'll carry him, and perhaps there is something we can do." The man lifted Estoh, then braced and tossed him over his shoulder. Juli glared at Eathu, but the half-breed didn't look up. "You left me, you coward," said Juli. "None of that now," said the man, and turned back the way Eathu had fled. "Follow me."
"Will he be okay?"
said Juli after they had gone a few steps. "I don't know," said the man. "Poison, I think, but who can tell what kind?"
"What is this place?"
said Juli. "Well," said the man, "it's a place you shouldn't be. Now, tell me how you arrived here. Were you lost in the Scarshay? Perhaps found a way in that way?"
"No,"
said Juli.
"We were in an old part of the outer city when we found a broken storm drain. We crawled in, and it was so dark we fell."
"I see," said the man. "How unfortunate."
There was another of us,
said Eathu weakly as he struggled to keep up with the man's pace. The half-breed barely came to his waist.
We couldn't find him. Can you send someone to search for him?
We'll see, said the man. They continued, stopping at larger doors in the hallway. The man opened them with a heavy set of keys at his hip. Through these doors were other hallways, with their own sets of doors, their own cries, moaning, and voices calling out for help, cursing their existence. There were the howls of beasts and the barking of dogs. There were shrieks Juli was sure could not have been made by men or women, and other noises that made his hair stick on end and his skin crawl with chill bumps. To Juli, there was no rhyme or reason to the path they took, only an endless pulling inward. They'd enter one door, turn right, walk for some time, then go through another, only that time turn left. It went on until he began to worry if the man left, there would be no hope of finding his way out. He'd starve there on the cold stone floor. But finally, the man came to a larger door, one made entirely of metal that stretched to the ceiling. Here we are, said the man as he produced his loop of keys again. He found a thick, heavy-looking key, then slipped it into a keyhole in the middle of the door and turned it. Metal rods retracted inward, and the door swung out in two parts. Light illuminated the room, and Juli had to block his eyes. Beyond the door stretched a hallway lit by hundreds of torch fixtures, its floor smooth as glass, white and spotless clean. Juli looked down at his body. His feet were black with grime, covered in blood-red cuts and the deep purple of bruises. His pants and shirt were matted and wet, soaked through with filth. Then he caught sight of Estoh. The Nahemish boy was whiter than the floor of the room, so white it seemed impossible. All except his leg, which was half a circle of swollen black flesh, half a maze of bright red veins. Eathu gasped. This way, said the man as he strode down the hall toward a set of ornate doors at its end. A mixture of sunset brown wood and bright, polished bronze that sparkled in the flicker of firelight. He walked to the door and knocked on it firmly, 3 times. Enter, rumbled a deep baritone voice. The man pushed the door open and motioned for the boys to enter. Juli crept forward as a new terror washed over his body. He shook as something deep in him reeled at the thought of stepping through that door. As he reached its threshold, he froze until the large, firm hand of the man pushed him the last few steps before following to block the way. As you said, Rham, said the man, and where you said they would be. Juli looked down at the white floor. In it, he could see a distorted reflection of himself, elongated and fat. Around it, the light of the torches danced. He focused on it and bit his lip. His stomach growled. This Nahemish boy was bitten, it seems. Something in the water. Something poisonous, said the man. Take him to one of the side rooms and treat him as you can. I shall see to him personally, said the deep, rumbling voice. It can't be the god mage, thought Juli. His legs felt weak. His body shook. Yes, lord, said the man. There was a loud thud as the doors shut behind him. So few now, said the voice. Look at me, boy. Juli felt his bones rattle. His head snapped up. The room was circular, with a high ceiling curved into a dome. At the center of the room stood the tallest man Juli had ever seen. He wore dark, thick robes. His face was broad, copper-skinned, with dark eyes rimmed with blackness. A long, braided beard hung to the middle of his chest. At its ends were caps made of brilliant, bright silver. Atop his head was a high, square cap, much like the man who found them had worn. It was the god mage, lord of the Sek. Juli felt his stomach roil. His skin crawled. He dropped his gaze from the man's dark eyes to take in the rest of the room. Behind the god mage was a table, atop which laid a body. A white sheet covered it, except the head, which was wrapped in a white bandage. From it stared a single, terrified eye. It rolled around the room before landing on Juli. It was a bright sky blue, Near the bandaged body were tables filled with steel flasks and jars of colored liquid, some a crimson Juli feared he recognized. Around these were spherical objects that floated, spinning in the air, and small pots filled with fire. Near the edges of the bed, other men and women stood, though they were wearing white robes and metallic face masks that covered their features. All were silent, looking from Rham to him and to Eathu. Rham ran a hand across the body on the table. It shuddered, eye spinning in crazed circles before landing back on Juli.
"Are you going to help Estoh?"
said Eathu. Juli turned to the small boy, mouth agape. How had he spoken? "Estoh, is that his name?" said Rham as he walked to the two boys. "If he can find it in himself to survive until we are done here, then I will save him. All in due time." Eathu looked up, like he was about to say something more, then closed his mouth. Juli was relieved. "You're from the outer city, then? Found your way below?"
"Yes, God King,"
said Eathu. Rham paced between the boys, then came to Juli and squatted. Even then, he towered over the boy. "Can't you speak, or do you let this half-breed speak for you?" Juli's eyes burned. He worked his lips open and closed before a quiet, "I can speak," left his lips. Rham smiled. Good. You're hungry. I can feel that in you. So very hungry. Tired, cold, exhausted. You'd like to be home, no doubt." Juli nodded, and Rham stood. "Well, I've no issue with that. I've food here for you, new clothes, even a way home." Juli's stomach growled, and suddenly, all at once, something lifted from him. Some vital thing that had numbed the hunger, the pain, the fatigue, and as it drained out of him, he realized how much he wished to be back at home. Even if his ma was drunk, or his da was in one of his moods, he wanted his own bed, clean clothes. He wanted it as much as anything he'd ever wanted. "There is only the matter of the tithe," said Rham. Juli looked up. Rham stared back with eyes that felt they would peel him away. "I require a tithe from all my subjects. Usually it is 1/10 of what they have. Men, women, children for the pens or the armies, grain, fruit, liquor, gold, silver, copper, iron, ships, cloth, silks, perfumes, whatever they have. An offering of flesh and goods, that is what I require. And for that, I bring Vulameshi peace, prosperity, wealth." Juli stared on, transfixed by the god mage's dark eyes. "You've nothing but rags in each other. I can't quite take 1/10, so I'll have to take half."
"What do you mean?"
said Juli. "I'll have one of you as tithe," he said. "That is the law from a kingdom to a man, even a boy. A price for everything." Bile rose in Juli's throat. He looked from Rham to the body on the table, wrapped in white sheets that hid whatever lay below, to that bright blue eye that shone with a terror beyond anything he could imagine. He looked from it to Eathu, whose tattered clothes were falling apart, whose black, greasy hair was a mess of tangles, then to his own bare, beaten feet.
"How?"
said Eathu. "The first to name the other," said Rham. "He shall be the one to strike the deal." A long silence passed.
"But why?"
said Eathu, and Juli's heart jumped into his throat. He thought the moment had passed, and the young half-breed boy had sealed his fate. He felt his hands start to shake, and his tongue went dry in his mouth. Could he speak? Rham towered above him, and Juli was sure he was taller than even the statues in that green, beautiful field they'd wandered into. "I've explained why. A price for everything, nothing given, ever. The strong take, the weak give. What I have, I've taken, and I wish this world filled with such souls. Hard souls, souls that do not balk at what must be done, at paying a price for what they deserve." At this last word, he pounded the haft of his spear against the floor. The sound rang out metallic and hard. Juli felt the noise in his chest, punching him like a fist. He felt the pain in his feet, his legs, his hands, out to the tips of his fingers, and he was hungry, so awfully hungry. Juli felt the words on his lips. It was sinking in. If Eathu spoke, he'd never leave. He'd be stuck here, maybe below in those dark rooms, maybe next on the table. He looked at Eathu. The boy's lips were trembling, and he felt his gut drop. In his mind, he saw Eathu fleeing in the tunnels, his crying, the fights, the bullying, all the times he'd stood up for him.
No,
said Eathu, voice shaking. But as he spoke, it was too late.
Take him,
said Juli. As the words left his lips, a heaviness lifted, like some terrible burden had finally slipped away.
Juli, what? No.
The younger boy started to cry then, to scream his name. Juli held his eyes closed, and blackness found him, as deep and dark as the tunnels they'd marched through. He clapped his hands over his ears and dropped to his knees. Over it all, he heard the doors to the room open again, and Eathu's screams passed behind him, disappearing down the hallway. Minutes later, he felt a large, heavy hand on his back. "That's enough," said Rham. Juli looked up, eyes stinging with tears and filth. "Come and stop that sniveling. You've made a hard choice today, I know it. But you will come to understand that you've grabbed hold of the slippery tentacle of your destiny. And if you prove strong enough, you will reel the Leviathan in." Rham led him out of the room and into the now quiet hallway. Ahead, the steel doors they'd passed through were closed again. "What is your name?" said Rham.
"Juli."
"I'll send someone along with food. They shall show you home." As the god mage turned to leave, Juli shuddered and hugged himself.
What are you?"
he said before Rham cut him off. "The boy no longer exists for you, Juli," said Rham. "He is mine now, not yours. Only remember that if he had spoken first, you'd be where he is now, and neither of you would have left if none had spoken. I shall heal your Nahemish friend, and if he proves as strong as you, he shall recover in time." Juli sat hard on the floor and watched Rham leave. He pulled his legs to his chest and hid his head in them. He thought of the man in the gibbet, how he had sat in a similar way. He thought of this, and thought of Fife, and thought of Estoh. Then he thought of Eathu's ma and pa. He thought of hot mornings where he'd had nothing to eat, how he'd wind up at their small shack, smelling the fresh cooked bread before he'd even entered. True to his word, Rham fed him well, large trenchers filled with fruit and soft cheese, dried meat, dark jellies, and tall pitchers of cold, watered wine. And when he'd eaten, guards found him, bathed him, dressed him in new clothing, led him back to the outer city, and left him. Now, with a full belly, Juli sat as the crowds of the Sek passed him by. It was daytime, and the temperature was rising. In the days that followed, Eathu's parents came to his home begging to speak with him, though his ma, who had hated the couple for as long as he remembered, never let them cross the threshold of their house. They pled, cried, screamed, but his ma only said that she'd asked him and he knew nothing, though never had she spoken to him of Eathu. Estoh returned a day after Juli, walking with a limp that never healed. Juli wondered whether he told Eathu's parents what had happened. He wanted to ask, but the Nahemish boy avoided him. He never saw Fife. At night, Juli would lay, staring at the ancient dry wood of his room's ceiling and wonder at the strength the god mage said he possessed. He'd said his decision was a first step. Juli wasn't sure where that step was supposed to lead. His days he spent alone in the dusty squares of the Sek, trying to recall the voices of his friends, trying to imagine the destiny Rham had spoken of and how he might hold it. But when he closed his eyes, there was only darkness, an emptiness that stretched into the distance forever.